Welcome everybody to the next lecture in our series, Toxic Relations, Histories of Violence. My name is Jan Musekamp. I'm the Deputy Director of the German Historical Institute here in Warsaw, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the German Historical Institute, but most importantly also on behalf of the University of Warsaw Department of History. Yes, and I think I'll turn it over directly to Prof, who will introduce the speakers, and we will have a nice discussion. And after the discussion, we'll also have the opportunity to ask questions. Yeah, of course, in Polish as well. The reason why we do it in English is for the international audience that will watch the YouTube channel, hopefully. Okay, and I'm turning it over to Prof. Thank you.
Co-founder. In history, in contemporary history, but not in early periods.
Your book was early. Okay, my book was earlier. This is a very good argument. So first of all, thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation here to speak in Warsaw, to have this discussion with my long-standing colleague and friend Basha Klich, whose works I really appreciate and who were always methodologically inspiration for what I'm interested in. The reason why we, by the way, do this in English tonight evening is maybe not for the global audiences. We don't know what happens after the emission, maybe. but it was rather because Basha didn't want to dominate me linguistically. So she said, if we're going to speak English, we might be more or less on the same level. What I also
bad right now, but it wasn't like that.
What I also doubt, by the way. So, but it's a pleasure to discuss in no matter which language with the both of you. So the question was, how did I start this academic interest in this form of violence? You just heard from Dobrowna Kauwa that one of the books I wrote was about the German occupation in Poland, and especially about the sexual interactions between the German occupiers and the Polish women, sometimes also the Polish men. And one of the chapters was about sexualized violence. And when I've been researching and writing this book, it was with some sources that I used, some materials that I gathered, really clear that the form of sexualized violence or the violence was connected to the setting of war and occupation. So with some of the materials, it was really crystal clear. And in other of the sources I collected for the book, like the attacks by men, mostly occupiers, on women, they were rather mentioned in passing, like casually, as it was an experience they did already know, they had already experienced before, or they knew all too well that they somehow didn't go into detail or didn't elaborate on it. So one can speculate now about a bunch of reasons. Of course, the Polish occupied did not talk too much to the German occupiers about this form of crimes, but with some of the sources I had the impression that it's not only the context of war or the context of occupation that I see, but there is a context of an experience or a continuum of gender-based violence that is somehow hidden in those sources that extends beyond the very fact of a war or occupation context. So when I've been dealing with those sources, I started to wonder about the specific place of war, about questions of continuities and discontinuities when it comes to gender-based violence, and also about the question, how can we actually grasp them, these discontinuities, how can we interpret them properly as historians? Back then, it happens, I had to finish the book, and I didn't delve deeper into the question of these discontinuities, but as a kind of research question, it stayed with me during all those years, also during the years when I've been doing academically other things. And then quite a while ago, I decided that now it's time to come back to these kinds of questions of gender-based violence, of violence against women in a longer perspective. And the actual catalyst had been, what is also telling, I would say, that I saw a statistic about domestic violence and murder of partners, murder of women after a partnership. And although I have been researching in the wider field of gender and violence for quite a while, historically seen, I was totally struck by those numbers I had in front of me. I mean, these were some numbers, if I remember correctly, from France and from Germany, where you could learn that in our today's society, every 3 days, there is probably a woman murdered by her partner or ex-partner after she left the relation. And when I, for the first time, although I'm already for a longer time in this field, like consciously had a look at those numbers, I was really, it really hit me, and also it refreshed this interest in dealing with with different forms of gender-based violence. And so now I came back with a book project that is still work in progress, and hopefully will become one day an overview on how different European countries ignored, denied, acknowledged, battled gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and sexualized violence in a longue durée perspective. So now coming back to my initial interest from the occupation period with this question of the continuities, discontinuities, this is then the idea to have a longer look at this phenomena that is today in statistic more and more present in the media. I think we now have a pan-European debate and a bigger sensibility about this question. And I want now to trace it historically, and we can maybe later on discuss a bit where the foci of historiography are so far when it comes to different time frames in the 20th century that has been a violent century, as you already put it quite rightly. Yeah, the idea is to stop with the Istanbul Convention. So the first time when on a pan-European level there is at least the attempt to regulate domestic violence, to motivate or force the European country that they integrate this into their penal codes, and they also offer the victims of domestic violence a certain frame of help and assistance. So this will be the end, the finishing point, and the starting point is probably mid-19th century with the first women's movement, because, and we can talk about this later on, they touched upon the topic of violence against women, what is not so known, I would say, so far in the historiography. They never did it prominently, but the topic was still there and did not appear in public discussions only in the 1970s, as we can read for Western Europe at least sometimes. So, but it's more hidden and it's under different titles, I would say.
Okay, so my situation was a bit different than Maren's because she was working on the subject of war, so it was quite obvious that the violence is somewhere there. It's all about violence. And my intention when I started working on private life, generally speaking, so it was just my doctorate thesis in the end of 90s. And so I would say that I never intended then to research violence. I wasn't ready for that at all, and so somehow this violence came to me. I wasn't prepared. I have to think about it later and find my way to cope with that, etc., etc. So I was working on Krakow, private life in Krakow after the Second World War, and it sounds great, beautiful time. Even it was Polish People's Republic, still it was Krakow, and it had some kind of charm, etc. So so I used a lot of typical sources for this kind of research, mainly memoirs, but it was really hard to find any details about it, but I wasn't aware even that I needed somehow to find it. And then it was first time when I felt the power of oral history. which appeared to be very important experience. And I was, Dobrowna asked about it, and I started to think how it came to me. So using, as typically in oral history, I learned, it was my first steps in the method, and everything was quite new for me. It was the second year of my PhD studies, and using the snowball method, I came across a gentleman, very kind guy, extremely nice, extremely open, and ready to talk about his life. He was open to talk about everything, and everything was very important here. And I never used his story in my book because he was talking about everything but Krakow. It was a typical biography of a gentleman who spent his life in different places in Poland, traveling, migrating, looking for education. His wife, he followed his wife, etc., etc. Finally, he ended up in Krakow, but his story wasn't mainly about Krakow. So it was useless in the sense of my book, but generally speaking, was extremely important when I think about my way of my studies, let's say. So he told me very bluntly how he had abandoned Catholic Church. And it was very important in his story. I would like to explain to you how it happened. That is how he was caught by the priest in a very in a boarding school in a very intimate situation, and he was extremely beaten by this guy. At this time I felt completely not ready, helpless with this story. I was shocked with his open, his very open story of his pain, let's say, and not only pain. So it was a bit of shock. Right now, I think for majority of our students, for example, who are working with oral history, reading the memoirs, etc., I wasn't ready then. So it also showed me then that the act of violence, it's very important for me because it was not only simple in brackets, simple act of violence, but the violence, like in this case of my protagonist, of this gentleman, I recognize that there is much more in violence than this simple act of violence. So first of all, it was this ideological sense. So it appeared that this act of violence changed his life somehow. Yeah. So this was it has somehow this ideological sense, the religious one, etc. So turning point in his biography, I could say right now I could recognize it, simply speaking. And what he also stressed during this conversation, it was humiliation. So it was not about physical pain, it was mainly about humiliation. And it hurts more than that. And then, what I'm aware of it right now, it's that this, what was extremely important, it was this act of talking about it. So he openly talked about this violent act, what he felt, what it was. So it was extremely important. And today probably I could call it maybe emancipatory act or somehow of character of this act. So it was, as I said, I wasn't ready to talk about it then, like I'm talking about it right now, but I recognize it in this way. So I think that it was also very important for my writing about violence because, and since then, I'm very attached to this individual experience of violence. So numbers are very important always, but this individual story of violence is extremely important. So at the beginning, in my case, was only like in your case, I think, was a source, historical source. So, so later I was much better prepared to these narratives of violence. So it appears in my daily work in archives, because I'm working with this kind of sources. When you are working with court sources connected with divorces, criminal acts. So right now I'm preparing this project on juvenile offenders. So there is everywhere is violence somehow appeared somehow. So what I'm trying to use, so since then I'm also very what is quite important for me is this construction of historical analysis, but we will be talking about it later, I think. So it's, so that's my story. It was 2,000. Yeah, I think at this point we have, as you already introduced, we have to introduce temporality in the very sense that when I now started this new project, I first had the idea that it will focus on a specific number of European countries. And then when I delved a bit deeper into the literature, I was quite surprised, positively surprised, how much historiography is on the way. So there is right now. So like as we said, so Basha's book on taboo, family and communism was really, I would say, a path-breaking one for state socialism as far as I can see. And when I now came back to the literature, there is more written. For example, there is something on Romania, there is something on Czechoslovakia, and there are more research projects on the way. So we can really see, and this is also fascinating and also a bit of rewarding to see that some of these white spots in historiography or some of these omissions, they do not exist any longer to the same extent as they existed, I would say, 10 years ago. But I mean, if you think about when do you start a research project, then it would be rather 15 or 20 years ago that the field has changed, and I would say also the legitimacy of these kind of research questions somehow have not completely changed, but there is more acceptance and interest in researching the private, researching the family, researching spheres that are beyond the classical political history.
And there I would say we see really how much in our understanding of historiography has changed. Of course, I mean, we might still say, or to be a bit careful, because this might be our view, who know very well what is done in the field, and it's still maybe not a consensus with all of the colleagues who are doing historiography that this is something to be researched and something what the history students need to learn or belongs like to the canon of historical education. But I see at least a bit more openness, and I have the impression that that's what I experienced for quite a long time. I don't know if it's true for you as well, that when I did my research on sexualized violence, I was always extremely pleased, and this is now very ironic, if I showed up in a conference program at the very end under the headline of something connected with women. And I think I cannot repeat often enough how often, and this was still the years 2010, I mean, it's not so far away, how often I had been introduced by somebody saying, yeah, this is Maren Röger, she's doing some research on women. And then I was always very astonished, because I had been thinking, okay, so part of my project is sexualized violence. Okay, there are some women in it, but for my understanding, there are not only women involved in the question of sexualized violence in wartime, but for this we need the soldiers, we need the paramilitary, they're quite obvious, usually men. So I never fully got this way of thinking how somebody who's a clever historian in his own writings and might be intellectually and analytically very capable to write his own or her own books, but mainly his own books, comes there and introduces me and my research project and says, oh yeah, this is Maren Röger, she writes, she's researching on women. And for me, this is still so telling. I hope we moved a step forward in this question, although I do see when I am now introducing this new research project that sometimes, you know, if the person with whom you talk tries to categorize what is the other person doing quite quickly in this kind of oral situation, then you get quite quickly something like, yeah, like, okay, so gender history is also now very, I don't know, very up to date in Poland, in my country, or this and that. And I'm not sure if it really helps us when it comes to societies, if we are so easy to classify those questions under a form of gender history. And now we are back to the question of why it was excluded from historiography. Because you can say, okay, everywhere where maybe women, men, or non-binary people are involved, we can classify this as a gender history. Yes, we can do so, but I mean, it's at the heart of power relations in society. It's a question of class, it's a question, how does a society, which kind of violence, in which spheres does it tolerate? Which does it not tolerate any longer? Which violence does it want to see? Which does it finally starts to punish? And which does it discuss? So, although I'm proud to call myself a gender historian, I'm not always sure if this quick labeling is what helps us in the broader historiography, because I think the questions here addressed are far bigger than questions between women and men or what happens in the family. And now your question, why was it not integrated in the broader historiography? I mean, it's of course a huge one, yeah. But I would repeat that what we see for a long time is this focus on the political, also in the very sense of a political mass violence. And those questions, domestic violence, but also the semi-private violence, violence at the workplaces, violence at schools, for example, and maybe nowadays digital violence, had been for a longer time not properly conceptualized. So how this violence is somehow interconnected with other developments that happen in most of the societies we are interested in Europe in different decades. And especially, I would say, for the post-war period, I'm interested in your position on this. For the post-war period, I have the impression that for a longer time, there was a bit of a naive idea that this explosion of the mass violence that we observed in the Second World War, we had an understanding that there is still political mass violence, and maybe there's violence in families, but it was nothing that was properly researched and somehow conceptualized how these different forms of violence are interconnected. And I think it's a very tricky question in the very end, methodologically. Maybe this is why nobody tries to do it, or maybe people try to do it and failed, and so we don't know about it. But it's an important question, and I think we should try to answer it. At least try.
Yeah, so I have to agree with, I would like to agree with Maren, because my experience are also quite positive in a sense of international cooperation, because when I began my systematic studies to the book on taboos and among others this domestic violence, I was lucky enough to be a part of a quite interesting group of researchers under the umbrella of the project Physical Violence and State Socialism. And it was a group of about, as I remember well, it was 2012 or 2015, 2012, I think. So, because Ida was 2 years old, it was something like that. And so it was hard time, generally speaking. But it was led by three great historians, men, by the way. So Paweł Kolarz, Thomas Lindenberger, and Jan Berendt. And it was the total group of 12 people who were working on extremely different kinds of violence. So since starting with Stasi, and ending up with my studies on private life. So we spent, I think, 2 years thinking about the sense of notion violence. What does it mean, truly speaking? How to connect us, and it ended up. Yes, I like it very much. And so this constant meetings and discussions and misunderstandings, truly speaking, because I will try to give you some examples of that, but maybe later. So I got this impression that the Stasi, for example, violence used by Stasi, and these transformations of usage of violence in Stasi case, or it was very like topic of that time. So the waves of violence in Russian army. So it was another like project within this project. Different topics and studies. So probably those examples were much more interesting for general public. I never ask about it because we have been working together in this small group of people. But I have never personal experience that my research were somehow less important than the others. So this political military violence it was as much important, or my studies were as much important as the others. especially that we have another cluster of researchers, 3 people who are working on child abuse, for example. My colleague did it for Hungarian case, and it was institutional, mine, and the one other. So we have been, and the Pavel Kolarz case on the violent women in Czechoslovakia. So, as I said, it was extremely difficult to somehow connect those different violences, even if it was still about the act of violence. So we tried to put it into the box made by Collins and this micro-violence approach. But right now, I'm not sure it was the best choice. But it was like 10 years ago. So even this reflection, sociological reflection on violent acts changed during that time. So I think that what is generally speaking extremely important. It's not only this division between this, let's say, state violence and these tiny private violences or violent acts, but only this also the division between different violent acts within the private sphere. So I would even, for example, for my studies right now, it's extremely important to have in mind, and it was even visible during our discussions in this project, that we have this private. When we try to imagine the institution like a children's home, let's say. So within this institution, we could find some examples of typical institutional, governed by state or influenced by state, controlled by state violence. And it is connected with some possibilities of controlling this space by this semi-private even spaces by the state. So we have some, for example, regulations connected with the violent acts or way of disciplining children, yeah, for the institutions. But on the other hand, in the same institution, we have these interpersonal, very often very cruel acts of violence between children, for example. And it's private somehow, yeah, within this institution. So it's another problem which we still have. But it's somehow still about the, and we have to remember or stress it in this point, I think, that it's all about power. Yes, of these power relations over the victim, for example. So, and the second point, when we are thinking about this post-war situation, and this is also somehow the answer for the question why it wasn't discussed, because we have, there is a strict vision of the state which is violent. Yeah? So we have violent framework for the society, and it's really hard in methodological sense, to connect these two situations. We have the violent state, which should control somehow the violent situation in privacy, in the families. Especially in the fascist or Nazi situation, but also communist, of course. So, it's quite typical when we have this discussion in this research group that I was asked this most important question in the field. What is this, your stories, or these tiny stories of this beaten wife, for example, what it is all about, what this has with communism, what it do with communism. So the situation is the same as in GDR as in Western Germany, and there was some cruels about it in the group. So yes, it is important question what socialist, communist, fascist has to do with violence in private spheres. But I'm still thinking if it should be the most important question. I'm not sure about it. I'm not sure. It depends on historians, I think. On the other hand, generally speaking, historians, even if they focused on these big stories, for example, mass violence, which is in the very center of, because it's shocking what people could do to other people. Yeah, so it's this power of numbers are very important here, and we have this spreading situation. We have this like tiny cases, which are really hard to be connected with one another. Yeah, so it's difficult here.
If I may, I think there is something to it, what you just said, that this is the question you got. How is this connected to the concrete political situation? Mm-hmm. And therefore, sometimes for these forms of violence, I think in the reading of many historians for a long time, it had something, anthropological, what just comes back. It just repeats itself. When I think about the whole historiography, for example, on sexualized violence in wartime, this was for a very long time the dominating argument, that there were some historians that said, okay, we do know that always when there is war, there is always sexual violence, so check, we do know this, we don't have to somehow research it in detail because this is something what belongs to sexualized violence. And I think this was also an argument to not go into detail. I mean, to not look what is exactly in the sources, and can we see differences between this theater of war and another theater of war? Can we at least try from the scattered sources that we have to make a difference and not stop at a kind of argument? It always happened that when there is wartime, soldiers raped women, or the same arguments. It happens that there is domestic violence and there is beating.
Always where it will be.
Yeah, it always where it is and it will be. And so therefore, this kind of universalization that protected or shielded from concrete research. And I think in this very moment when we as historians, we try to explain something about a specific time, at the first very superficial side, one can say, I mean, it makes us a kind of vulnerable when you in the very beginning don't have an answer about how is your incident connected then to the specific time frame you're researching. I mean, of course, we have answers because it's about perception, it's about the way it's negotiated in front of court or how it is then picked up on in the media, etc., etc. So we do now know this, but I think at the first sight it might be not so easy. Then you have just a case of somebody beating somebody else up in the private sphere, and you need a very good methodological approach to prove how is this connected to a specific time. And I think this is why maybe a lot of historians shied away for quite a long time from these kind of questions.
If I could add one thing, so it should be at the very end, but I think this is the place for that. So I think that as a result of those neglected areas, like for example these domestic violence acts we studied, we are talking about right now, it's the very painful neglected or blank spots in the history, in the other areas of history, like history of family, for example, or history of childhood. So these big spheres which are even if we could also describe them as fields which should be better developed in, for example, Polish historiography, but still the question about violence is very crucial here, not to idealize it, like in the case of family in Poland, because the majority of studies in Poland dedicated to family 20th century, I'd rather describe as the idealization of this field.
Maybe you start.
Yeah,
Your
okay.
book is already out.
So the fundamental question that has been on my mind for years is that we gain from reconstructing. So what we should do besides this reconstruction, or do we really need this reconstruction of these tiny pieces of violent acts in private sphere? We have thousands of them. Yeah. So yeah, and I have this experience that I was writing. I chosen some cases to explain, taking them, explaining the situation, using this micro.
It was a great approach, if I may say so.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, really.
So we could find thousands of these cases, but what is extremely important, or what is the key point in these studies of violence, is to not just reconstruct it. And we need it, of course, but this is the very first step to do that. And then we have to... what really interests us is how the violence exists within society. Yeah? So this is the question, how it works within the society. And it includes, for example, the social reactions to violence. And then we became what we are. So we became historians. As historians, and I was taught like that by Andrzej Falba, who always asked me, so what changed here? Do you notice something, some kind of transformation? So this is the starting point, and we have this ending point, and what happened between them. So I usually try to follow these transformations which happened. And so even if this act did not change at all, so this beaten wife looked at probably the same in the act, the documents I read from 50s and in the 70s, the social reactions to this somehow changed during that time. So, and not only because this is also about the reaction of for example, victim. I use this word victim, but in brackets, let's say, because this is very problematic in the studies of private violence also. So we are interested about perpetrators, about bystanders, about experts, which is very important field of studies right now. Natalia is here, Kasia is here, who are working on the subject. So in field of domestic violence, we have two main group of experts who dealt with that. It's the lawyers, of course, and the psychologists, but I could also add, of course, all the examples of medical studies here. For example, Bibiana Mosakolska, Kasia interviewed her recently. So we could notice through those sources, we have thousands of sources from this perspective. We have some reactions in the press. We have some letters from women to, for example, what was studied by Bartłomiej Gapiński, to the church centers, kind of. So people are writing, thanks God. For example, in the case of Polish famous memoir contest, we will find some examples of this existence. And so we have this private, this is an excellent source. When we have this voice, I like it very much, but probably this is my fixation on this subject, because I would like to hear the voice of people who are in this story, this sad story. But on the other hand, we have, for example, when I noticed this, my boys, I'm sorry, I'm coming back to them, but I'm studying like hundreds of individual files of boys who are in the institutional care. And we have detailed description of their own family situation. So they are in the institution, but we have information about the family they coming from, and about, there is a question in the file proposed by psychologists. Have you been beaten, or have this boy, was this boy beaten at home, for example, or the parents used violence or not? So the system is in the situation. Clearly, we could notice the state in this private life here. So only one point more, it's this statehood and the privacy here. What is quite important, and it's somehow connected with the communist fascism and Nazism and this politics here, but it's more about society. So, and also the idea of citizenship, it was studied in German case also. So how this proper, we could observe how these patterns of good citizenship, good citizen was created. And we could also notice this in this discussions about violence in the 60s, 70s, 80s in Poland. Not only in Poland, but generally speaking in socialist states of that time. So good citizen is a cultural one, and the culture means using no violence. So violence is somehow excluded from this pattern of being good father, good mother, etc. So we have, yeah.
Physical violence?
I think it's much, in these cases, in the late communism, for sure, it wasn't clearly said. But when we have these descriptions, it's visible that it's not only physical violence, but also like symbolical, probably it's a little bit different level. But mental, let's say, economic, even if they not use these words. The words are not used in the sense, but it is there somewhere there.
There was much destroyed, so yeah. I mean, when we're talking about like the old book of mine that came out in German in 2015 about the German occupation, it was actually this kind of situation that when I started working, a lot of colleagues said to me, yeah, maybe interesting question, but you will never find the sources to prove it. And then obviously I started researching and had to be a bit creative where to look for different source materials. Then I found the proofs. I can unfortunately not give the narration that some of the Polish media wanted me to repeat in the year 2016 when the Polish version was published. They wanted to hear long stories by me about a taboo and like obstruction that I met in the archives or in the wider audience. Unfortunately, I couldn't give them back then those stories because it did not happen. I, of course, had the situation quite often. I would say that I came to some archive and said what I was researching on, and the archivist looked a bit irritated at me. But I would say this was rather because of the reason that every topic that was somehow connected with sexuality back then was not supposed to be in the public sphere and to be addressed in an archive like some foreign researcher comes in and says she is now researching sexuality during the German occupation. I mean, this was something unheard of. But I never had the impression that there was like obstruction out of some historical political reasons, or I maybe was too naive, but I don't think that this was the case. Rather, this kind of irritation that somebody is now dealing with such private matters, so that, and also such matters that didn't belong so far to the official image and historiography of the Second World War. So I had the impression that the irritation was rather on this level, but I had to be then a bit creative, of course, and everything what we now know from the Alltagsgeschichte, what to use, like the court files that you have to read in a very specific way, the ego documents that you have to search through, but also to be open sometimes to read novels or other forms of fictionalization for also a historiographical project. So I did all of it. I think I mean the amount of materials I skipped through for the project, I actually don't remember how I did this back then, but yeah. 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 This was a big problem. Oh, this was a really big problem, yeah, because I know that I regularly had to go to Płotsk, and they gave me only 5 documents a day. And if you're looking for something so specific like sexualized violence, yeah, then you sometimes come there and in every file is only one little piece of paper, and sometimes you find something, but very often not. And then if the archivist didn't cooperate and took a pity on me because I just arrived, I went back to Warsaw. But fortunately, back then, and I really have to say this for this research, I had worked at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw in a researcher's position, and all the archival work I did from here, from Warsaw, from Poland. But for me, it's unimaginable that I would have written this book sitting at a German university and trying to plan my research day in the semester breaks. I think it wouldn't have been the same book because I sometimes only went for 1 hour. Yeah, but so this was the old book of 2015. What I now try to do in this new big book is also a kind of a history of knowledge, a history of perception, a history of sense-making, and this on a comparative level. As I said in the very beginning, it's the attempt to write a kind of synthesis about the research literature we have so far on domestic violence and gender-based violence, because here on a meta level, I somehow have the impression that the historiography is there. There are so many good studies done, and sometimes they're there under different headings. But I'm wondering, what is the puzzle piece we need to translate the excellent historiography we have into a broader historiography on the 20th century in Europe, on a violent 20th century in Europe? So why does this historiography that is there does not translate in the broader historiographies or kind of overviews? And so now at the very moment, my dedication is to the very fact to write such a book that tries to synthesize and to inscribe this in the broader history of 20th century Europe.
I would at what point, for those who would like to look for the sources or the try to probably for the first time to identify the important moments in this history. And this is quite visible in the case of East Central Europe, that we have this moment, in very, very often political moment, when like 1956, 1981, so the moments of so-called crisis or social crises, when the domestic violence plays the role. Yeah, so it's much wider discussed. We have some new heroes, let's say, of the public. So, for example, the worst mothers who use violence. So new icons of this social imagination, let's say. So this is quite, I would advise to use this strategy, let's say, to look for these special moments. And the second point, it's you mentioned gender, and I think that this is quite important to think about gender approach here and to recall it somehow. Because there is this interconnection between the discourse about domestic violence and transformation of these gender regimes. And we could not describe this transformation gender regimes without the domestic violence. It is not quite well described in case of Poland. I avoid it somehow. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. So it's still open. It's very well described in gender in German case by this comparison of GDR and Western German. And it shows different roles of different institutions in different countries. So we have the very different, for example, the role of courts and law, very important in Polish case. And the completely different story in, for example, Western Germany or Western countries when we have this feminist NGOs, which play the somehow equal or similar role. So this is also this. So the institutions are quite important.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, let's start.
More violent. No, I'm curious what you are doing. What you are answering. Actually, I don't think that it's opposing. I mean, it's different approaches, and I would be more comfortable to answer this question when the book that I will or try to write would be already finished. So, but I'm far from this. I think you can't write any overview about the ignorances, the debates, the perceptions, the sense-making without the detailed studies that have been written and are at the moment written, and without this kind of methodological sensibilization in which traps not to fall. Because what we can learn from microhistory is also that they alert us really to read closely and not to draw quickly some conclusions, because it might now quickly fit into some narrative that we have chosen, but to really have a close look on that, what happens. But if we can really, and this is a question with an overview book about domestic violence, you can, of course, see how, as Basha already said, yeah, how does society react to it? How do, for example, how does terminology in court files, how does it change during the decades, or how this does change? But what you, with this topic, I think at least, will never get is to have an overview that can state that we have these and these countries that were extremely violent, then, you know, the domestic violence swaps over to some other countries, and then it comes back to Northern Europe. I'm just speculating now, in the 1980s, because the numbers we do have, and I know that I said in the very beginning something about numbers, but this was the contemporary approach. The numbers, historically spoken, they're absolutely unreliable, and it's not possible to draw some kind of senseful conclusion from it. Therefore, I think we always, even if writing sentences, have to redraw on this close reading, on the history of knowledge, on history of perception, on history of sense-making, that such an overview does make sense at all. But it couldn't be something like, you know, there it was more violent in the private sphere than in other places. I wouldn't know right now how to write such a book. I would feel more comfortable if you speak in 5 years again. So.
It depends on this synthesis, of course. Yes.
This was very diplomatic.
Yeah, so I think that I couldn't even imagine that I'm writing my stories without this frame. Yes, this context. It's in Polish case of post-war history. We have this very specific situation that we don't have. My students just asked me about the very good book which gave general synthesis of transformation of Polish society after the war, and I answer, sorry, we don't have it. So we are still waiting for that, general synthesis. We don't have it. Yes, this big of tiny synthesis even. So, but we have some very good books which give us the general vision of the society. But what is quite important for me right now, and I think that I'm old enough to tell it right now, because 20 years ago I didn't care about it. But right now I'm looking for these questions, these big questions about society, yeah, about the history of society. So, in this perspective, I treat violence, which is probably not in the very. I don't intend right now to write a book about violence. I'm not ready for that, even if it's micro or macro perspective. But I think that violence itself is understudied in Poland, for example, and probably even in this part of Europe. So violence is extremely important sign of the aspect of our living and our mutual relationship within society, and the transformation of our approach towards the violence is worth to be studied deeper. And on the every level, possible level. And this, what is the domestic violence is a kind of, it's extremely important in this sense, because this is the training for people to work, to behave, to negotiate their own social existence in the public. So it's extremely important what are our experiences in privacy. First, experiences with the violence, the acceptance of violence, or the rejection of this attitude. So I have no doubt any doubts that it's important to study it on every level, even middle level. Not macro, but middle. So the characteristic of this kind of studies in case of the domestic violence is to have even not to it's important to read, for example, the expert studies, or the, for example, articles in the press about different events. But I think that it's important for us as historians to be aware what does it really mean, and this coming back to the sources dedicated to these tiny events. Awful one. I have to admit that reading the private sources dedicated to domestic violence is extremely, let's say, unpleasant. Yeah, at least. And I have this period in my life when I was sitting in, probably I mentioned it somehow, somewhere, but it was Katowice archive. And I got a lot of documents dedicated to children, which were abused in 1 to 3 years old. And it was really, this was the beginning of my studies, and I could only sit there and cry, nothing more. And we probably in this kind of studies, we somehow need this phase of our experiences as historians to understand, to try to understand what they really mean. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I have answer. Yeah. We need our psychotherapy, after that. Yeah, psychotherapists who could help. In oral history practices, we have the evaluation of our work, so maybe in this case we need it also. But I cope with that without psychotherapy, so somehow.
So a kind of supervision for. Yeah. Mm.
This is the question to the public. I think, as I mentioned before, I treat it as a very important part for much general historiography, so history of family, especially history of women, or gender history, and history, right now mainly history of childhood. So this is the basis, one of the very important point in this kind of studies. But it also, I think that the very good profit for me personally, it was also the kind of training in writing about it. So create the narration, which is somehow on the very good explanatory level. But on the other hand, it is not. It's readable, let's say. I was there in one of reviews of my book. I read that there is no enough source meat. So not so many cases which are violent enough to be excited. Yes. So I did it on purpose. So I learned myself. Teach myself and learn to do it in this particular way, to write about violence without too much violence. Mm. Yeah, probably. Yeah. It's training. So yeah.
And maybe to add to all the aspects and repeat what I said earlier, I would say it must be an integral part of the history of our societies. So not only a subsegment that we use to classify and use in historiography, but I would say it's at the very heart of the society. And I don't want to dwell on those numbers, but still, if you have a look at why we are discussing this in most European societies and are coming back to more detailed also regulations and changes in the penal code, we do see that obviously we still seem to have a huge societal problem that is not solved. So it's not only a question about the historiography, but a question that still reaches in our present lives and the way we negotiate power. And so therefore I would just refuse to answer such a question, to explicitly have to demonstrate why this is an important research question, because I think it's one of the most important. Of course, it's this one that interests me, but still I really think that it's at the heart of to understand something that is at the core of society and something what is still fragile. And coming back to what you just said about supervision and what does it does to us as historians, I think this is, there it's also important to work with the students. I mean, I'm now since decades in the field of researching sexualized violence in war times. And I just 2 terms ago came back in teaching it. And as you said, one is sometimes sitting over the, is sitting there in the archives, reading the sources and is totally troubled or even crying. But then I saw some of my students sitting there after we heard some relations from women who survived this. And there, all of them there were somehow crying and couldn't continue the class. And this also made me aware that this is a topic that is, of course, a historical one, but it's also one that, I mean, might still touch upon some of our today's identities and how we might feel in society. But this is the present part answer of your question, not only as a historian, but I think also as a citizen.
If I could recall here these studies already mentioned by, for example, Tomasz Wiślicz, he also mentioned very important aspect of this violence in violent acts in society, and maybe we could add it here, because with 20th century is extremely important because we have very clear transformation. It's visible, yeah, this changing of attitudes. And the one of the levels of this transformation is this shift from the treating the act, the appearance of act of violence. So it's losing this power of being the act of communication. I like it very much, this idea of the violence as an act of communication. It's even visible in the films in mid-20th century, that it's still used as an act of any kind of communication. So we could remember about it. That it could be treated by victim, let's say, of the violent in this sense. So we are learning how to understand it. And when we are thinking about this our contemporary world and the question of violence, to the very end, I would like to mention that I just read great PhD thesis about violence, and this is about sexual harassment and the huge discussion about it in the 90s in Poland by Paweł Bagiński. It's almost defended. It will be defended in 2 or 3 weeks, but it shows how it was important. I noticed my studies are important somehow to understand how it works nowadays. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we could not understand what's going on or what's went on like 10, 20 years ago or just now without what happened in the second part of 20th century. Yes. And it became very important in this moment, let's say in the 90s. Mm-hmm. This was my last sentence.
I don't need a last sentence, so we can have the question.
My question goes to Professor Röger, and it is a German question. It's about definitions. So you talked about intimate violence, domestic violence. violence in the private sphere, or at some point I even thought you talked about every other violence, so violence that is not public, political, or criminal. And of course, there is everything from animal abuse to school bullying in it. And I don't think we have to settle for one. I
already settled, so.
Definitely not in this discussion, but I wanted to ask you about your project specifically. You talked about domestic and gender-based violence, but then with your time frame being quite broad, how do you deal with the transformation of the family home, for example, from the late 19th century to the Istanbul Convention? So obviously there will be more liminal cases, so to say, I don't know, people who are roommates from the working classes, for example, just after the war, or an obvious case, house servants. It's not necessarily intimate violence, it is domestic, in a sense it happens behind closed doors. Is it in the private sphere? From the 19th century perspective, definitely. From today's perspective, not so much. So what definition do you use? What criteria do you use? Thank you very much.
Thank you too for this great discussion. I know your works, as you are familiar, and I ask myself, because I think, and this is maybe too optimistic, I see a difference from the time we investigate, because as you know, I'm investigated in my last project, especially the 70s and 80s in People's Poland and in Ireland. And what I see is a change of this frame, as Barbara told us, the state, because the regulations, I think, is what where this micro histories meet the big history in brackets. When I was doing research on my last project, I went through the files of the Ministry of Justice, where we had this different approaches to it was not mentioned. It was solemnly based on violence, but marital breakdown. Marital breakdown, and we all know alcoholism was one of the most important reasons for it. And you saw that through the eyes of the bureaucrats, it is more important to have stable families than to have happy families. And I think this is something that has changed. We have the same observation we can make in the Republic of Ireland, where this has changed. And I can remember when I went through this whole reports by different counseling centers and psychologists, that there was always one theme that came up: education will repair everything. We have to educate men and also women, as women to understand men, and men that they are not so brutal as they were. Brutal was, I think, always the word. And I asked myself, what about education in your both cases? Maren, you mentioned the theme of class, and I think this is also connected to education.
Thank you very much. It's so nice to see you, three of you, in one place, in Warsaw. I have a question to all of you, but just want to come back to Barbara's words about language and the notion of victim in the terms of violence, domestic violence. Because when we talk about the sexual violence, the term survivor is now very popular. Maybe in Polish language, it's not so obvious and not so common. It's difficult to translate it in a good way in Polish. But I was really curious, why not victim in domestic violence? What is the difference, and what we should use? What language we should use to call those people who were affected by domestic violence, children, women, all who are perceived as victims. Yeah, thank you.
And I have like a general question to whomever would like to answer from the panel. So I would like to first say that I completely agree with the statement of Professor Kluczewska that violence is understudied in Poland, 100%. I myself am a young scholar, on my second year of studies. So not as advanced as Paweł Bagiński, whom PhD I've kind of saw more or less, and it's also amazing, and I agree with you. So it was nice that you mentioned him. And yes, in my own studies, I had the trouble with finding, for instance, contemporary representations of sexual violence. And I am dealing with very contemporary times, meaning post-Me Too, so post-2017. And, well, because I'm Americanist, so I am using a lot of, Western feminist apparatus, both in theory, and I'm analyzing, English-speaking corpus, and the main keyword in my research is consent. And I would like to ask you if this is something that comes up in historical research, because my background is completely different. It's cultural studies, and this term is very, very much a liberal one. Consent only appeared recently in Polish law, but maybe it is a question that you kind of deal with in some way or another. So I am really, really curious about that.
I have maybe a similar question in terms of the fact that somehow we might have this presentist view as it comes to the history of violence. And my question is, how do you both and how do we all deal with cases that we as 21st century people see as violence, but they weren't seen as such by the people they affected? So it's like, in a way, a moral or ethical question as well. Do we have the right to impose our terms of on other people's experiences? What I'm referencing is are cases like, I don't know if you're familiar with the diary of Molly Applebaum, who was a 14-year-old Jewish girl who was hiding in the Polish countryside with her cousin, and both her and her older cousin, they had sexual intercourse with a Polish peasant who hid them. But it's never explicitly mentioned as violence in the diary. It's viewed as 14-year-old Melania as something fun, as the only thing that's happening to them in this years spent lying under the floor of the barn. And she has never said it was violence. But from our point of view, it was not only violence, but like sexual violence against a minor. So this is very, very difficult. I wanted just to give it as an example of how do we deal with cases like this. Thank you very much.
I want to add a follow-up questions, because I was wondering exactly the same as historian working on 19th century. I was wondering how you would approach methodologically this dilemma, how to catch the violence of the moment. So how to define the violence, which for the victims, as we call them victims, is actually violence, and what is for us violence. And also, with a point of view of method, I was wondering about those silent, violent situation in domestic sphere, how much the fight back, the reciprocal violence of the victim towards the oppressor is a ultimate evidence of the violence experienced. Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for all the questions. Many of them are, of course, very relevant when researching a phenomena that we nowadays perceive in a specific way, that surely decades ago hadn't the same notions to be used, or even in the same or in a similar way to be perceived. I cannot answer the question you posed, how it was, for example, exactly in the sources of the 19th century, because I'm in this longue durée interested in other phenomena. I'm interested in the very fact how in broader society it was addressed. How, for example, in the women's movement, the topic of violence against women or domestic violence was raised at all. And there, for sure, we do know that those were completely other notions that they used. We couldn't go with our today's terminology and look through the writings of the societal movements back then. And I think in general, it's really important, and this goes maybe also back to Jakub's question, to reflect on the use of the terminology also in the very sense, do we intentionally or unintentionally bring also some our own ethic or moral ideas in? I was very impressed when I read a few months ago, there is a book by a German scholar with a cultural studies background. She's called milieu, and the book is just called Rape. I do not know if it's translated into English or Polish yet, but she dedicates quite some time of her book with the title Rape to the very question, what notion shall we use? What does survivor imply? What does victim imply? What could be alternatives also to survivor? Because then the argument against survivor has been made that if you call somebody who experienced sexual violence a survivor, then you ascribe the person to the role of this single event in her or his life. Yeah, so it defines identity. Do we really want to do this if we use this notion? I found this really helpful in thinking also about, let's say, problematics of or problems of notions that we maybe some years ago declared better than the notion we used before, victim, but then you see that this recent notion also has some shortfalls. And what I also learned from this book, and this made me think a lot about historiography, is the need, the societal need, maybe sometimes also the researchers' need to hear the story in very clear words, what happened about every act of violence, be it sexualized violence, be it maybe domestic violence. Because we do know that people might talk in completely other notions about it. They might just, let's say, make an allusion to the event, what happened. And it made me, I'm curious on your opinion also on this, because it made me think also a lot about how I treated back then my sources on the Second World War. And I remember that sometimes I was just a bit, or nearly a bit disappointed that it was not so clearly described, and I had really to read between the lines. And when I debated this with a colleague of mine who has a background in literature studies, I once again understood that I was back then in this kind of mindset of a historian who wanted to prove, like the other historians before me, wrong, who said that there weren't incidents of sexual violence. So I wanted more or less, almost like in the logic of a court, the clear language that gives the historical proof. And when I read this book by Mitu Sanyal, who argued very much for also, let's say, a person who was affected by sexual violence, the liberty to choose her or his own words to describe. And it was also a call for societal acceptance, so that we do not focus so, I don't know, sometimes a bit obsessive on specific words or a specific way it is talked about. It made a big impression on me also in the very sense, what does it mean for us as historians methodologically? Because in the end, of course, we need the sources and we prove the argument. Yeah, this hopefully answers some of the questions. Now here I'm not sure if I completely got it. I'm interested in gender-based violence. Is in the literature, there are not tons, but very different notions. Most usual, I would say, is intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And as you recalled correctly, under this notion of domestic violence for a long time falls everything what is in the domestic sphere, as long as still the authority of the head of the household has not only the right to punish the woman and the children, but also the servants. This would fall under this notion. I will narrow it down more or less on the debates where it is possible on, in fact, gender-based violence. And why I'm interested in this kind of domestic, gender-based violence and sexual violence at the same time is one outcome of my research so far. When I started, I thought, okay, no, I think I will exclude like sexual violence and try to concentrate on domestic violence. But what I saw until now is that all the big societal reactions, or when something happened in the broader debates on intimate partner violence, it seems, at least in Western Europe in the second half of the 20th century, to have started with a huge public outcry on a prominent case of sexual violence. So my understanding is that, as was already said, that these most spectacular, the most brutal cases, very often than the cases that involved sexualized violence, they were somehow the trigger or the catalyst for then a societal movement that had then a broader look on gender-based violence or also violence in the domestic sphere. And this is why I do integrate both of these debates, because in terms of, I would say, a history of social movements, both of them usually belong together. The one is triggered by the other. And now maybe you and the other things.
Okay. Later. Okay, so thank you very much. And I think that we have here quite basic aspects of the topic which were raised. So the language and the present perspective we used for the description of it. As usually in different other cases, freedom, let's say, revolution, let's say. So nothing new. But to the core. So when I'm thinking about act of violence, when you're trying to imagine this act, so I was still thinking if we always think about this act of violence as something which is bad itself, yeah. So when the act of violence is very often described as the crossing the border, the physical violence, for example, the crossing the border, the integration of the body of others, yeah. So sometimes when we are in the situation of we're trying to protect someone, this act of violence which be described as something which is evaluated as a good act, yes. So this is something which we have to have in mind, and it's quite clear. So we have to remember still, answering to the question of Marta, I think that we have to remember, this is very typical in the case of punishment, punishing children with using violent acts. Yeah, it is treated as something which is neutral, and this is something which is extremely interesting in the story. Yeah, so this transformation of understanding of these violent acts. Without it, it would be only like description of some very unpleasant or sometimes unpleasant acts. And when we have this, the events, like in the case of Molly, which is even difficult to understand it, because when I was reading it with my students, everyone had a little bit different explanation of this, what happened there in this village. But this is the extreme, I think, example. But we have when we have one by one the examples of violence, I'm afraid we will not, and this is about micro, we will not be able to judge if it is violent or not. So we need this framework of it, of culture, society, etc. Without it, it could be, probably we could say, no, it is not violent. Forget about it. But on the other hand, when we took this, this is all about the research perspective. When we focus on the voices of those who experience it, it will be extremely important even to focus on how they perceive it. And during the 20th century, we will see somehow, not progress, I couldn't tell it, like we still have violent acts in families in Poland, and we have films about it. And when I asked, I watched the film, how it is called, Good House, yes, Good Home, by Smarzowski, and I asked Smarzowski during this screening in Krakow, is it something Polish in this film? No, he said, no, it's universal. And I was surprised by this answer. Because from my historical perspective, there is very much something, in this Molly story, this is the war story. When we have this my boys in the 60s, it's very like socialist state in this story. And it was a question about education. Very important one, and I think that's even the co-education in this, the beginning of this co-educative schools are extremely important. This learning, very smooth learning of coexistence of two sexes. Okay. Yes, and Kuba, I have no answer for your question about victim because I use this word. I'm sorry, I couldn't find any other. But generally speaking, we have to explain what we use and what we understand under this this word, the notion. The victim, in what is quite intriguing for me, it's that the victim, there is something. In the domestic violence, when we compare it with, for example, I have a lot of friends who are working on Holocaust, and there is heroism in these stories. In these stories on the domestic violence, there is no heroism, not at all. Of course, it's the simplification. I'm sorry for the simplification, but when we are starting to talk about it. To show it very in a simple way. There is no ideas of creating monuments for the victims of domestic violence. Yeah, so they are victims, not heroes, not at all. Yeah, so. This is maybe I'm not. I'm too tired right now to explain how I have some doubts about this word victim here. Yes, I would try to find something different to avoid on the one hand this question about heroism, on the other the victimization. And I'm sorry, I think I. But in a very good way, yes. So I feel. Yes, this is very good.
It wants to